Okay, let's unpack this. World War One. We all have some image in our heads, maybe those famous pictures of muddy trenches.
Yeah, the Western Front looms large, doesn't it?
It really does. But what if I told you to picture a battlefield thousands of feet up, like carved into icy peaks,
Hmm,
where the weather could be just as deadly as enemy fire, and, just moving a single heavy gun was this unbelievable struggle.
that's exactly right. While the Western Front tends to dominate um, our understanding of the Great War, today we're diving into a lesser-known but absolutely crucial theater. The Italian Front, high up in the Alps.
The Alps,
Yeah, it
wow.
presented a completely unique and, frankly, incredibly brutal set of challenges. The scale of the fighting, the human cost here, it was just immense. It's a story that really deserves a closer look.
Absolutely. And to really get a handle on the intensity of World War One, generally, you just have to think about artillery.
Oh,
I
definitely.
mean, in major battles on the Western Front, like Verdun, they were firing millions of shells, sometimes in a single day.
Mind-boggling numbers.
And get this, 60%, that's right, 60% of all battlefield casualties in World War One came from artillery.
60%. It was clearly the dominant force of destruction across the board.
So what's interesting then, when we turn our attention to the Italian front, is how that artillery dominance played out in such an extreme environment.
Right. You
Yeah.
still have the different types, the guns firing flatter trajectories,
Yeah.
the howitzers lobbing shells in high arcs, and the mortars for close support.
Mm-hmm.
But imagine trying to maneuver these massive pieces up those incredibly steep, rocky mountainsides.
It almost defies belief.
Mhm.
We came across a comment somewhere that really painted a picture, something like, where a goat can go, a man can go.
I remember that.
Where a man can go, he can drag a gun.
Wow. That gives you a real sense, doesn't it?
Mm.
The sheer physical effort just to get artillery into position, way up there.
Just exhausting to even think about.
And that raises a really fascinating point about the effectiveness of all that firepower.
How-
Well, while both sides did bring artillery to bear, the mountainous terrain often made accurate targeting incredibly difficult. Steep angles, unpredictable winds,
Right, hitting anything specific must have been tough.
very tough. Plus, just keeping those high-altitude positions supplied with ammunition was a constant and often perilous undertaking.
But they did manage to get some truly massive guns up there somehow.
Oh, absolutely.
We saw mentions of Italian howitzers, these huge 280 millimeters and even 305 millimeter cannons.
Yeah, positioned around areas like the Misurina Basin and the Monte Croce Pass.
And they used these to bombard towns, places like Moso and Sesto.
They did, and the destruction was significant. Sadly, that included civilian casualties as well. I mean, 305 millimeter, those are battleship-sized guns,
They're
practically.
some of the largest pieces used anywhere in the war, right?
Absolutely. Capable of immense destruction.
Yet, you mentioned effectiveness. If we look at the accounts from what they started calling the White War,
The White War.
especially early on, it seems artillery wasn't always the magic bullet against well-fortified Austrian positions high up.
That's a key point. Initial attacks often faltered despite artillery support. Those high mountain forts could be incredibly resilient.
It shows a kind of limitation, doesn't it? Even with powerful tech, the environment could just negate it.
Exactly. Lesson military planners have had to relearn time and again, really.
And can you imagine what it must have sounded like, being a soldier there, constantly under bombardment?
Terrifying.
Apparently, they could even identify the type of artillery just by the sound. Like a French 75 millimeter had this sharp, decisive note.
Almost like a crack. Yeah.
And the German 105 millimeter howitzer, they nicknamed it the whiz bang.
Whiz bang. Right. Because you heard the whiz of the shell first, then the bang of the explosion almost immediately after.
And the British perspective was different again. First, the burst of the explosion, then the whiz of the incoming shell, and finally, the distant boom of the gun that fired it.
Just think of that constant, terrifying symphony echoing through those remote valleys.
Unimaginable.
It really underscores the psychological toll, even when the terrain might have, lessened the physical impact sometimes.
And this brings us right to that key aspect you mentioned, the White War.
Yes, it wasn't just about fighting another army. It was a battle against the environment itself, the extreme high altitude, the relentless snow and ice.
Right.
These factors fundamentally shaped how the war was fought. They influenced everything, including how artillery was used, and perhaps more importantly, its limitations.
Absolutely. And when we talk about the environment, it wasn't just an obstacle for moving guns. It was like a deadly enemy in its own right.
Oh, completely.
The logistics of keeping troops supplied in those conditions, it must have been an absolute nightmare.
Indeed. Forget paved roads. You're talking steep, treacherous mountain paths.
Just goat tracks, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Supplies had to be brought up on the backs of pack animals, mules, mostly, or even carried by the soldiers themselves. Heavy equipment, ammo, food, everything.
Just sheer manpower.
Yeah. Later in the war, both sides did undertake these incredible feats of engineering, like the road of 52 tunnels on the Italian side.
That road is legendary. I read about that. 4 miles long and like a third of it carved directly into the sheer rock face.
Exactly. Tunnels blasted right through the mountainside.
The human effort to build something like that under wartime pressure is just staggering.
It really is. It makes you wonder how they even managed to get those heavy guns up there in the first place.
Yeah.
Any ingenious methods mentioned?
Well, necessity is the mother of invention, right?
True.
It seems like they used a combination of brute strength, animal power, and even improvised pulley systems, capstans, block and tackle to haul artillery pieces up ridiculously steep inclines.
Probably had to break them down too, right?
Often, yeah. Guns would be partially disassembled, moved piece by piece, and then reassembled at higher elevations. Slow, exhausting, dangerous work.
Unbelievably so.
And yet, despite all that incredible effort, the environment remained this constant lethal threat. The Reddit discussions we looked at mentioned a truly horrifying statistic. Something like 10,000 soldiers killed by avalanches in 1916 alone.
10,000 in one winter, just from avalanches. And the White War articles confirm this: countless deaths from exposure, extreme cold, hunger, disease.
Things that don't show up in the combat casualty list.
Exactly. Factors that often prove more deadly than direct combat with the enemy. The mountains themselves were claiming victims on a massive scale.
Chilling.
And then you have these specific, almost unbelievable examples of fighting in that environment. Take the Siege of Castelletto, for instance.
Right, the seemingly small, like, 700-foot rock formation.
Yeah, but it became this vital strategic point. And what's remarkable is how a single platoon, initially Germans, later reinforced by Austrians, essentially held up much larger Italian forces in the valley below, just with machine gun fire.
Because they had the high ground and clear sight lines.
Precisely. The Italians tried everything to dislodge them: climbing attacks up near vertical rock faces, assaults launched through thick fog, large-scale infantry charges.
And they were just cut down.
Repeatedly.
Yeah.
It sounds almost medieval, doesn't it? Like storming a castle keep.
It really does. They even tried mining, didn't they? Tunneling underneath.
They did. An incredible feat in itself. They spent over a year digging a tunnel and planted a massive gelignite mine beneath the Austrian positions.
Did it work?
Well, partially. The explosion did significant damage to the Austrian defenses, but the aftermath was horrific for the Italians too.
How so?
Carbon monoxide poisoning as they rushed into the crater and tunnels, plus being hit by falling rocks loosened by the blast. They managed to capture a section, but it took another 3 months of brutal fighting to finally clear the Austrians out.
Just for this one rock feature. Incredible.
Then you have the fighting on Monte Piano, this high plateau where the initial border actually gave the Italians a slight advantage. But the Austrians fortified a nearby peak, Mount Rudo, and essentially dominated the Italian positions from there with artillery and machine guns.
So, back to the artillery problem, given how hard it was to move heavy guns, how did that influence Italian tactics at Castelletto?
That's a great question. Because moving the big guns was so difficult, the Italians often had to rely on infantry assaults supported by smaller, more mobile artillery pieces, mountain guns, mortars.
Which weren't powerful enough.
Often not powerful enough against well-entrenched enemies in solid rock positions. The Austrians on Castelletto had clear fields of fire and could just decimate those infantry attacks.
It was a meat grinder.
Pretty much.
Heck.
And at Monte Piano, what followed was this brutal back and forth, both sides digging extensive trench systems, tunnels, basically mirroring the Western Front, but at extreme altitude.
Trench warfare at 7,000 feet.
Exactly. The winter conditions were particularly brutal for the Austrians there initially. They relied on slow porter columns for supplies, constantly under Italian artillery fire.
Until they built that cableway.
Right. They eventually built a cableway, which became their vital lifeline for the next 2 years, an engineering feat in its own right.
And the Marmolada Glacier, the idea of a city under the ice, that's just astonishing.
Isn't it? Built by the Austrians. Barracks, hospitals, gun emplacements, all connected by kilometers of tunnels within the glacier itself.
Wow, how is that even possible?
It's an unbelievable testament to human ingenuity, or perhaps desperation, in the face of unimaginable conditions. adapting to the environment on a massive scale.
Creating shelter and supply lines inside the
Yeah.
ice.
And then you get these incredibly poignant discoveries years, decades later. The remains of Austrian soldiers recovered from the melting Przena Glacier.
Preserved in the ice.
Preserved for decades, still bearing the wounds from shrapnel. It just brings this deeply human element to the immense scale of casualties.
It really does. Shifts the focus from grand strategies to individual tragedies.
It reminds you that each number was a person.
And the sheer audacity of some of the attacks, like the Italian soldiers scaling the Tofana di Roses, using the Via Ferrata.
Those iron ladders and cables bolted directly into the rock face.
I mean, that's dangerous enough for experienced modern climbers with all the safety gear.
Exactly. Imagine doing that under enemy fire, carrying equipment with the constant threat of rock falls, deliberate or accidental.
One of the sources mentioned a near miss, didn't it? A huge chunk of rock breaking off.
Yeah, highlighting the constant danger these soldiers face, both from the enemy and just the unpredictable mountain itself. And you compare that to earlier climbers like Vellopiana and Gaspard, who scaled that same face with, hemp ropes and basic gear.
Shows the evolution of mountaineering even in war.
Right. And then you have the archaeologist Franco Nicholas, who talks about these artifacts and recovered remains as silent witnesses.
Silent witnesses. That's powerful.
It's not just about the official records of battles won or lost. It's about the individual lives, the personal stories lost in these extraordinary circumstances.
That museum exhibit he created sounds incredibly moving. The deconstructed soldier's kit displayed above empty shoes.
It powerfully conveys that sense of absence, doesn't it?
Right.
Of a life abruptly ended. It compels you to look beyond the big picture narratives.
Definitely. And this sort of leads us towards Italy's entry into the conflict in the first place. I mean, with this brutal, often stalemated fighting, what actually brought Italy into the war?
Right. Well, Italy initially stayed neutral when the war broke out in 1914.
They were part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, weren't they?
They were, but it was a defensive alliance, and they argued Austria-Hungary was the aggressor, so they stayed out. But then, in 1915, they secretly negotiated and signed the Treaty of London with the Entente powers, Britain, France, and Russia.
Ah, the secret treaty.
Exactly. This treaty promised Italy significant territorial gains after the war if they won. Regions like Trentino Alto Adige, the Julian March, Istria, parts of Dalmatia, basically chunks of Austria-Hungary.
In exchange for joining the war against their former allies.
Precisely. And strategically, for the Entente, bringing Italy in opened up another front against Austria-Hungary, hoping to divert enemy forces from the eastern and western fronts. Italy's geography let them attack from the south.
And according to that Ask Historians thread we looked at, Italy's initial motivation was largely driven by this national ambition, a desire for territory, a place in the sun, as they put it.
That seems to be the consensus, yeah. Initially, it was about expansion and national prestige, but the reality of the war on the Italian front quickly transformed that.
Into something much more desperate.
Indeed, especially after the catastrophic Battle of Caporetto in 1917. That defeat was devastating. It almost knocked Italy out of the war.
Huge impact on morale, right?
Profound impact. The focus shifted dramatically from territorial gains to sheer national survival. The government had to mobilize absolutely everyone they could, even very young boys, the Ragazzi del 99 and the Customs Guard, just to hold the line.
Wow. From ambition to survival.
Quite the shift. But something significant happened after Caporetto. There seems to have been this real surge of national unity and resolve.
Fueled by propaganda.
Yes, fueled by powerful propaganda. Figures like the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio, the naval commander Luigi Rizzo, who sank an Austrian battleship, the one-legged war hero Enrico Toti, they became national icons.
Their stories used to inspire the troops.
Exactly. The Ask Historians contributor even drew an interesting parallel to the Soviet Union after Stalingrad in World War II.
A moment of national crisis, forging a new determination.
Precisely. And that renewed determination, coupled with strategic reforms in the Italian army leadership, ultimately led to the decisive Battle of Vittorio Veneto in 1918.
The final victory on that front.
Yes. It finally brought an end to the fighting on the Italian front and played a really significant role in the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
But at a tremendous human cost, as you said earlier.
Absolutely staggering. Throughout the war on the Italian front, hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The numbers are just heartbreaking.
And beyond those killed or wounded in combat, we also need to remember the prisoners of war.
That's a crucial point. Globally, World War I saw something like 8.5 million soldiers captured.
Almost as many as were killed in battle.
Almost. Becoming a POW was a very common experience for soldiers on all sides.
And Italy held prisoners, too.
Oh, yes. They held a large number of Austro-Hungarian prisoners, and there's one particularly tragic episode involving them. The transfer of tens of thousands to the island of Asinara in late 1915.
Asinara. I read that was horrific.
Truly appalling conditions. Overcrowding, rampant disease, totally inadequate supplies. It's a grim example of the immense logistical challenges, but also, sadly, the often callous political indifference towards the suffering of enemy combatants during wartime.
The damned of Asinara, they were called.
Yes. Thousands died there from cholera, typhus, malnutrition.
Yeah.
Just a terrible chapter.
It really highlights how the tragedy of the war extended far beyond the actual battlefields.
Absolutely. Later in the war, starting around 1916, Italy did begin to use foreign prisoners for labor, agricultural work, industrial work.
Was that common?
It happened on various fronts.
Oh.
But in Italy, it was done under the strict condition that their labor wouldn't compete with the national workforce. It just shows the complex economic and social factors nations were juggling, even while dealing with huge numbers of prisoners.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here into the Italian front, what are the really key things we should take away?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's the story of incredible hardship, not just from enemy action, but from that relentless, deadly environment of the high Alps.
The mountains themselves were a major player.
Absolutely. They played a defining role in this theater of war. It reveals this crucial but often overlooked part of World War I.
Filled with these extraordinary tales of human resilience, of adaptation to almost unimaginable conditions.
And ultimately, of immense human sacrifice, all set against this landscape that was both, breathtakingly beautiful and utterly unforgiving.
It really makes you reflect, doesn't it? Knowing the extreme conditions, the initial ambitions that led Italy into the war, and then the eventual incredibly hard-won victory. What does the fighting on the Italian front truly tell us about maybe the nature of human conflict itself, and that incredible will to survive, even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds?
That's a profound question, and maybe another thought to leave people with. With those glaciers continuing to melt due to climate change, revealing more of these silent witnesses.
Right, the bodies and artifacts.
How might our understanding of this white war, this unique and brutal conflict, continue to evolve and maybe deepen in the years to come?
Definitely something to think about, a history that's still emerging in a way.